I want to describe the specific institution of the made man, the formally inducted member, because it is central to understanding how the organization maintained loyalty and discipline. To become a made man, a button in the slang, a person had to meet specific requirements. He had to be of full Italian descent, with some families requiring Sicilian descent specifically on at least one side. He had to be sponsored by an existing made man who would vouch for him. He had to have demonstrated loyalty to the family over time through his work as an associate. In some accounts, and this requirement is disputed in its universality, he had to have participated in a killing, demonstrating that he was capable of violence and that the organization therefore had leverage over him through his criminal exposure. The induction ceremony itself. The specific details vary by account, but the consistent elements include an oath of loyalty and the pricking of the trigger finger to shed blood, with the declaration that this blood would be the initiate's blood if he betrayed the family. What membership provided? Protection. A made man had the protection of his family and, through the commission structure, the protection of all families against non-members. Violence against the made man from outside the organization required commission approval. This protection was real and valuable. Economic opportunity. Made men had access to the family's operations, the ability to participate in the specific criminal enterprises that the family controlled, and to earn from them. Status. Within the Italian-American communities where these families operated, being a made man carried a specific social status, a combination of fear, respect, and the particular deference given to someone who is understood to be connected. What membership required? Total loyalty. The Code of Omerta, the Code of Silence, the specific obligation not to cooperate with law enforcement, was the central requirement. A made man who cooperated with law enforcement had violated the most fundamental obligation of membership. The consequences of violation? Historically, death. The specific threat that enforced loyalty was not social ostracism or economic penalty. It was death. This enforcement mechanism is the reason that organized crime was so difficult for law enforcement to penetrate through the 1930s, 1940s, and 1950s. If the penalty for talking to the FBI is that you will be killed, and if you have seen this penalty applied to others, the incentive to not talk is extraordinarily powerful. I want to give you numbers. By the early 1950s, the period just before the Kefauver hearings that I will describe in episode 13, the 5 families of New York were, according to various federal investigations and journalistic accounts, controlling or significantly influencing the International Longshoremen's Association, representing approximately 65,000 dock workers in the Port of New York. Estimated annual criminal revenues from the waterfront, $150 to $200 million in goods stolen from cargo, kickbacks from employers, extortion of workers. The garment industry, an industry employing approximately 300,000 workers in New York City and generating several billion dollars annually in economic activity. Organized crimes take? Estimated at tens of millions annually, through union corruption and labor racketeering. The numbers game in New York City, generating an estimated $100 million annually, with the 5 families controlling significant portions of this market. The restaurant industry. Specific families held interests in restaurants across the city, both as legitimate businesses and as fronts for money laundering. Construction. As described, essentially all large construction in New York City passed through supply chains or labor arrangements that were at least partially controlled by organized crime. The aggregate annual revenues of the 5 families in the early 1950s, estimated by various sources at $2 to $5 billion. This is in a city with an annual municipal budget of approximately $2 billion. The 5 families were, in terms of economic scale, operating at the level of the city government itself. I want to make this personal. I have described across 4 years of episodes the city I lived in. Manny's Coffee Shop on West 54th Street, the jazz clubs on 52nd Street, the Oyster Bar at Grand Central, Katz's Delicatessen on the Lower East Side, the pushcart on the corner of Orchard and Delancey, the Automat on 42nd Street, Conchetta's Restaurant on Mulberry Street. Let me tell you what I know now about what I was walking through. The jazz clubs on 52nd Street. Several of them owned or controlled by people with connections to organized crime. The specific mechanism? Clubs needed licenses. Licenses required political connections. Political connections passed through organized crime. A jazz club that tried to operate outside these connections found its licenses delayed, its suppliers unavailable, its performers unavailable. Katz's Delicatessen. The Lower East Side neighborhood where Katz's operated was, in the 1940s, still partly under the influence of the organizations that had developed there during Prohibition. The specific form had changed. Bootlegging was over. The organizations had moved into other activities, but the presence remained. The restaurant on Mulberry Street where Conchetta made Sunday gravy, Mulberry Street in Little Italy, was, by the 1940s, the address of a significant portion of the Genovese family's social and business life. The restaurants on that street were not all controlled by organized crime. The neighborhood was not a crime zone. But the family was present in the neighborhood in ways that were real, even if mostly invisible to a visiting actress who came for the Sunday gravy. I walked through this city for 30 years before I understood what I was walking through. Not walking through crime. Walking through the presence of an organization that had integrated itself into the city's economic and social fabric so thoroughly that it was invisible. I want to address a question that I know some listeners are sitting with. If these organizations were so embedded in the city's life, and if the city continued to function and in many ways thrive, what was the actual harm? The harm was real, and I want to describe it specifically. The waterfront workers. The dock workers represented by the ILA were paying union dues to a union that was controlled by organized crime. Their wages were lower than they would have been in a genuinely competitive labor market with a genuine union. The hiring halls, the specific mechanism by which workers were selected for daily work on the docks, were controlled by organized crime, meaning that workers who refused to cooperate with the organization could be denied work. The workers had no recourse. The union that should have represented them was the instrument of their exploitation. The small business owners, the restaurants, the garbage collection companies, the construction subcontractors, businesses operating in territories controlled by organized crime paid tribute. Not a small amount. A regular percentage of their earnings. Businesses that refused to pay were threatened, vandalized, burned. The cost of this tribute was passed to consumers in the form of higher prices. Every New Yorker who ate in a restaurant that paid tribute was, without knowing it, paying organized crime. The workers in the garment industry. Similar to the waterfront situation. Workers paying dues to corrupt unions. The specific betrayal of the labor union, an institution designed to represent workers against capital, being used as an instrument of exploitation against the workers it was supposed to represent. The communities, the numbers game, the illegal lottery that I will describe in more detail in the episode about Harlem, extracted money from the communities it operated in. The specific demographics of the numbers game. The players were overwhelmingly poor, overwhelmingly from minority communities. The operators were organized crime families that were almost exclusively white. This is an extraction of money from the most economically vulnerable populations in the city, operated by an organization that used violence to maintain its monopoly. The harm was not abstract. The harm was lower wages, higher prices, fewer choices, violence, and the specific corruption of institutions that existed to protect people. Unions, police, government, from the people they were supposed to protect them from. The structure that Luciano designed in 1931 lasted, in its essential form, for more than 3 decades. Why? The Commission prevented internal war. The Castellamarese War had been destructive and had attracted law enforcement attention. The Commission's dispute resolution function prevented a recurrence. Stability allowed growth. The corruption of law enforcement. The specific relationships between the families and police departments, prosecutors' offices, and courts, built during Prohibition and maintained through regular payments, provided a level of protection that would have been impossible without it. Investigations were derailed, evidence disappeared, witnesses became unavailable. The Omerta Code. The specific threat of death for cooperation with law enforcement was extraordinarily effective. The FBI, which officially denied the existence of a national organized crime network until 1957, had almost no cooperative witnesses inside the organization. The economic integration. By the 1940s, the families had moved significant money into legitimate businesses: real estate, restaurants, trucking, waste disposal, entertainment. These legitimate businesses provided income that was not obviously criminal, provided plausible explanations for wealth, and provided additional economic leverage in their respective industries. The specific social embeddedness. In the Italian-American communities where the families operated, the organization was not experienced as entirely alien. It provided services, dispute resolution, loans, employment, that the official economy and government did not provide to these communities. The specific relationship between the families and their communities was complex, part exploitation, part protection, part genuine community connection. This complexity made it difficult to build the community opposition that effective law enforcement requires. I said at the beginning of this episode that I wanted to look at the organizational structure honestly, including, I said this carefully, the ways in which it was, in certain limited senses, impressive. I want to say what I meant. The commission structure that Luciano designed solved a real organizational problem: how to coordinate competing criminal enterprises without constant violence. The solution was elegant in the way that institutional design can be elegant. It identified the right incentives, aligned those incentives with the desired behavior, and created an enforcement mechanism that made defection economically irrational. If this structure had been applied to, say, the coordination of competing legitimate businesses in an industry prone to destructive competition, if this had been a trade association rather than a criminal cartel, it would have been praised. The intelligence required to design it was real, and this intelligence was deployed in service of extortion, corruption, murder, and the systematic exploitation of the most vulnerable people in the city. The elegance of the design does not excuse its purpose, but I want to name the intelligence, because not naming it leads to a misunderstanding of who these men were. They were not stupid. They were not merely brutish. The most effective organized criminals of this period were men of genuine strategic intelligence who operated in a specific environment where their particular skills, the management of violence, the corruption of institutions, the organization of criminal markets, were the relevant ones. In a different environment, with different options, some of these men might have been executives, lawyers, politicians. They became what their environment rewarded. This is not an excuse. It is the explanation I have arrived at after 40 years of living in the city they built. The map I described at the beginning of this episode, 5 points, 5 families, 1 commission. This is the map of New York City that was not in any tourist guide and not in any newspaper, or not often in any newspaper, and not in any official document, until the Kefauver hearings put it partially on television in 1950. But it was there. It was there when I was walking to Manny's in 1947. It was there when I was buying bread from Goldstein's. It was there when I was eating pastrami at Katz's. It was there when I was listening to Charlie Parker on 52nd Street. The city I loved, the specific, extraordinary city that I have spent years describing, existed simultaneously with this structure. Not despite this structure, not unrelated to this structure. Alongside it, interwoven with it, in some ways enabled by it, and in other ways constrained by it. Both cities were real. The city of the jazz clubs and the oyster bar and the Knish cart and the corner table at Manny's. The city of the commission and the waterfront and the garment district and the numbers game. Same streets, same years, same city. I have been talking about one of them since 1947. I am talking about the other one now. She stands. She buttons her coat. November cold, even inside Manny's, even now. She looks at you. Come back for the next episode. The speakeasy. Not the economics of it, not the politics of it. What it was like to be inside one. I told you in episode 1 that I went to a speakeasy when I was 11 years old. I want to tell you what I saw and what I felt being 11 years old in a room full of adults doing something illegal that the entire city was doing, that the police officers sitting at the bar were doing, that the mayor's administration was accepting payment to allow. What it felt like to be 11 years old in a city that had decided, collectively, to look away. Come back.